Welcome, everybody. This is a tremendous honor for me. I've followed the work of the Western Front Association for a long time, and to be invited to actually speak to you all on this is something that I find incredibly moving, especially since it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I've been studying the Lost Battalion for better than 20 years now, almost 25. And I like to think that I know something about what's going on, but every week I learn something new. So the way that I look at it is you never stop learning until they shut the lid at the end. So I've always got more to learn, and I hope I can share some of that with you today. Just to touch on the movie real quick, that's the number one question that people ask is, was the movie realistic? Is that what happened? Not really. The movie is very entertaining, and we have to remember that the movie is just that. It's Hollywood. It's a movie. It's meant to be entertaining. It's not a documentary. It leaves a few things to be desired, but overall, I find it a very entertaining film myself. I watch it from time to time with my sons. Of course, I can't watch it without sitting there kibitzing everything, so I kind of keep quiet on it for the most part. But if you enjoy the movie, certainly I wish that you'd read the book too. Then you'll understand a little bit more about what you're seeing on the screen. There was also a movie done in 1919 that was re-released in 1921 that actually featured some of the original guys from the Lost Battalion, including Charles Whittlesey, their leader, was actually in the film. Some of it was actually filmed in France right after the war at the site of the action in the Charlevaux Ravine. It's a wonderful picture to look at. It's got a love story in it because every movie back then did. But if you can get past that, it's a pretty neat film. So the story of the Lost Battalion, of course, goes back to the First World War and American participation in it. It is the story in a lot of ways of the American participation in the war, simply because it embodied just about everything that America stood for at the time, that America liked to see in itself at the time, and what America wanted to portray to the world at the time. The 77th Division, as we'll touch on in just a moment, was a very cosmopolitan organization that was filled with a lot of immigrants and truly did represent what American manhood was at that time. Charles Whittlesey, the leader of the Lost Battalion, was the first man in the First World War to be awarded the Medal of Honor. This is sort of like the Victoria Cross. It's the highest honor you can get. Whittlesey never felt that he actually deserved it. Again, we'll touch on that a little bit later. But he did represent an organization that in the public's mind and in the public's eye was the best that America had to offer. It starts with our declaration of war in April of 1917. We knew when we got into the war right away that we were going to have a draft army. There was no other way that we were going to be able to fight the war. The United States Army, National Guard, Marine Corps at the time stood at just 250,000 ready troops. The Germans had 3 million men in the field, so we knew that something big was going to happen. And in June of 1917, the first draft call went out. There were 10 million names on the first list. And there were two more draft calls after that, one in June of 18 and one in September of 18, and they had 6 million and 3 million more names respectively. The people flocked to join the service at the beginning. They wanted to be part of this. They wanted to help out. They wanted to do what they could. America had been neutral for a very long time, and there was a lot of sentiment in the United States that we shouldn't have waited that long. Here you see the famous Uncle Sam poster, which is pretty much a ripoff of a British poster at the time, and men lining up to sign up for the draft. One of the interesting things about the draft was that you didn't have to be an actual citizen of the United States to be drafted. You just had to live here. So a lot of guys that had left Europe, where there was mandatory military service at the age of 18, and they didn't want to serve in their own country, come to the Americas and find that here they got to serve their country anyway. A lot of them went willingly, very willingly. They wanted to be good Americans. They wanted to show that they loved their new country. And this was particularly true in New York City. At that time, New York could readily be recognized as sort of the capital of the United States. Washington, of course, is the capital, but New York was really the center of activity. When they put the draft together, they set up 16 campment areas around the United States, and they would draw troops from these campment areas and send them to localized training camps. And the one that was in New York was at a place called Yaphank. And that is where the 77th Division was going to train. Now, the draft Army divisions numbered 76 through 100. And this is the way that they did it. They would take them from a local area, send them to a local camp, train them together, and then ship them overseas together. The 77th would be the first National Army Division to reach France in April and May of 1918. They trained at Yaphank. Yaphank was out on Long Island, and this is something that you heard a lot of troops ask. Yaphank, where the hell is Yaphank? Nobody had ever heard of it. It was a quiet little town, not far from the Sound, that never raised any cane of any type. And there was a gigantic pine and conifer forest behind it, which they leveled so that they could make Camp Upton. These camps were enormous. Camp Upton at its height had 3,400 different buildings to house, train, equip, feed, and ship out 30,000 troops at a time. Now, remember, American divisions at that time were twice the size of European divisions. And these are massive organizations of 27,000 men in each division. And the 77th Division drew most of its enlisted recruits from the Lower East Side of New York City. A lot of the draft calls went out, and in September of 1918, they started to flow in. And in the 77th Division at the time, there were 43 different languages and dialects spoken just in that one division. It was really representative of the melting pot that America was at that time. And almost all of the European nations were represented in this. There were also American Indians, there were Filipinos, there were Cubans. And they would divide these units up sometimes by language, because there was quite a number of men that were drafted into these units that didn't speak English. As a matter of fact, a lot of them learned their English while they were in the military. And there's one fantastic story that I love to hear about is right there in the middle of the Argonne Forest during the battle towards the end of the war. There was 125 men in the 77th that were sworn in as United States citizens right there in the forest. These are men, by and large, that were in relatively good shape, that understood what had to be done, but had absolutely no military experience. And at that time, they weren't totally sure that they were going to be able to take raw civilians and turn them into trained troops to fight in our very first overseas action in just 16 weeks. It was still a theory. So they drew these men from the Lower East Side, and they put together these divisions. Now, this is a sort of a breakdown on a squared American division. Each division had 2 brigades. In the 77th, it was the 153rd and the 154th. Each brigade was divided up into regiments. There were 2 regiments in each. In the 77th, it was the 304th, 305th, and 306th and 307th. Now, the 307th and 308th formed the 154th Brigade. The 308th is the one that we're most associated with here. Each infantry regiment had 3 battalions. Each battalion had 4 companies. Each company broke down to about 245 men. And in the Argonne Forest, you would get to see exactly what combat would do to a 245-man platoon. For instance, Company A of the 308th went over the top the morning of September 26, 1918, slightly under strength with 241 men. 10 days later, they had 34 men left. The one place where the American Army was prepared was in its officer corps. Prior to the war, they had started the Plattsburgh program. The Plattsburgh program began in 1913, and what that was an officer training program. They took the best and brightest of society and sent them away for 90 days to train them to be soldiers, to train them to be officers. And one of those men that went away in 1916 for his training was a fellow by the name of Charles Whittlesey. Charles Whittlesey was born in Florence, Wisconsin, which is a tiny little logging town about 14 miles south of the Michigan border. When he was 13, he moved back east with his family, where his family was from, and he spent the rest of his growing up time in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He attended Williams College, which was sort of a prep school, and then he went to Harvard Law, and he became a lawyer. He dealt in contracts and regulations, a lot of banking law. He wasn't a trial lawyer, but he was very popular with the trial lawyers because he had an innate ability to look at somebody's case and find the faults in it. He was very, very meticulous in what he did. He was a very, very book-minded individual. He was noted at college for never once having been seen with a ball of any kind in his hands. He was a very, very intellectual individual. If there was going to be a prank played in college, it was something that he was involved in. It was going to be very intellectual in nature. He was also a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. He picked this up in a wave of socialism that came across America in the early 2 decades of the 20th century. And he firmly believed in the socialist ideal. Now, later on, towards the elections of 1916, he would leave the Socialist Party when the Socialist Party became too militant for him. It's not that he was not a lover of the military. He understood the military had a place in the world. It wasn't his place. That's the way he looked at it. However, when it became apparent that there was probably going to be war visiting our shores, he enlisted in the Plattsburgh program and allowed himself to be trained as an officer. As a matter of fact, he did such a good job that when he was called back in 1917 after the declaration of war, they made him a captain right off the bat. He skipped both ranks of second lieutenant. First lieutenant was made a captain, but they also understood he was not a combat commander. This isn't the guy that you wanted leading men in combat, but you sure wanted him doing the paperwork. So they put him in charge of the headquarters company of the 308th Infantry, trained at Camp Upton. There he was noted as being one of the finest officers that the 308th had. Very, very popular with his men. He treated them with respect and with reverence. They treated him with respect and reverence. They got along fine. He also had a tendency to overlook some of the minor infractions of rules. However, if it was an order, it was as something from God. It was dealt with, and it was dealt with correctly, even if he didn't fully believe in everything that that order stood for. He understood that he was there to do a job, and he was going to do it to the best of his ability. And while he was running the headquarters company, everybody understood that if the job was going to be bossed by him, it was going to be done right. The 77th headed over to France in April and May of 1918. And the first place that they stopped once they got over there was at Zuidkerk, where the British 34th Division trained them for a while. And then they handed them over to the French. And the French took them into the Baccarat sector. Now, Baccarat sector was a quiet sector near the Vosges Mountains. It was meant to give them a taste of what true combat was. It's a very American thing to want to believe that we know everything. We know what we're doing. We don't have to listen to anybody else. And we had had 16 weeks of basic training. And we just had some advanced combat training with the British. Why put us in a quiet sector? They found out very, very quickly when they got to the Baccarat sector why it was necessary to be in a quiet sector. When they flowed into the trenches the very first night, the Germans they were relieving the American 42nd Division, and the Germans across held up a sign that said, "Goodbye, 42nd, we'll miss you. Welcome, 77th, we'll give you hell." Nobody could understand how the Germans knew who they were already. They hadn't even been there 8 hours yet. They hadn't even been there 12 hours when the Germans introduced themselves, and they did it in a very, very violent way. Company B of the 308th was indicative of what happened. They were on the line that night, and of their platoon of 60 that was up on the front lines, only 12 came back. It was a very, very violent beginning to what they were supposed to face. And in the Baccarat, they began to learn about patrolling. They began to learn about wiring. They began to learn about liaison, not just with the French, but in their own units as well. It was small unit action, and it was an easy way to start things, and it gave them their blood. And the 77th was always grateful for being in Baccarat. However, Baccarat, they said, was nothing but a pushing and shoving match. The Vel was a real fist fight. This is where they came to face combat. When they got on the Vel, they were a little cocky. We've seen some action. We know what we're doing. When they got in the Vel, they found out they didn't know anything. The Vel is where the Germans had fallen back after the Second Battle of the Marne. After they've gotten beat there, they fell back to the line of the Vel River, and the American services began to take up positions. Now, on the left of the 77th was the 28th Division. They would see them again in the Argonne. On the right was the 4th Division. This was a very, very hot sector. It was a very warm summer. The Germans were using a lot of gas. But this is where they began to understand what true modern warfare was. This is where they learned to dig in, and they learned to dig in deep. They learned to dig in every time they stopped. This is where they learned that you didn't sleep one in a hole. You'd be killed. You didn't sleep two in a hole because you'd wind up to find your buddy's throat cut. You slept three in a hole with two awake at all times. The Germans would take American uniforms, slip into them, and slip across the lines, get into American chow lines, walk around and listen to what people were talking about and saying, ask questions. Didn't matter that the Germans had accents. Everybody in the 77th had an accent, so they fit in real well. And they would find out all kinds of information and go back. They were past masters at infiltration, and the 77 soldiers found them infiltrating the lines everywhere. They would come across them like ants, crawling through the brush, crawling through the wire, swimming across the Belle River, which is not much of a river by American standards. It's not much more than about 10 yards wide, perhaps 2 or 3 yards deep, but it was full of barbed wire for the most part. The towns of Fismes and Fimette on either side of the river had been leveled pretty much. There wasn't a whole lot of chance to bury soldiers. So this was classic World War I battlefield type thing. But this is where they got their blood up. And this is where the world began to see that the 77th was having problems. Now, as I said, the 77th was the first of the draft army divisions to get to France. So the Americas, the entire country was watching them. They couldn't mess up, because if the 77th collapsed, if the idea of a draft army didn't work, there was no other army for us to turn to. So the 77th had to succeed. The problem is that when they had trained, they had only trained as individual regiments. They had never trained as a division together. They'd never had that opportunity. This means that some of the liaison in between the regiments wasn't what it should be. There was a lot of unit pride, a lot of pride in the regiments, and the regiments weren't working and playing well with each other. And this was coming out in combat, causing lots of problems. And when General Pershing saw this, and he saw what was happening to the 77th, he said, we need to fix this. This would have been a public relations nightmare, and it would have cut America off at the knees when she was just getting started, just getting there and being able to help out and do part of it. So Pershing decided to make a change. Major General George Duncan was in charge of the 77th, and Pershing canned him and brought in Major General Robert Alexander to take over the 77th. We'll see George Duncan again later on in the war when he comes over again with the 82nd Division, which had Sergeant York in it. So George Duncan wasn't done by any means, even though he was pretty much cashiered out in shame. Major General, talking about Bobby Alexander is a little bit difficult sometimes. I did a chapter on him for a book last year called Pershing's Lieutenants, and I learned a lot about Bob Alexander. He is a true contradiction. He was a fabulous commander when it came to working depot divisions. Depot divisions were replacement divisions that we sent overseas to feed replacements into combat casualty holes. He ran the 41st Division. He was fabulous at it. He was just a terrific commander of a depot division. When they put him in combat the first time as a brigade commander in the 32nd Division, everybody hated him. He was just an awful commander. He jumped up and down a lot. He believed in screaming at people a lot. It was going to be done his way or you were gone. He was right all the time. He had an ego the size of Texas on his shoulder. He had come up through the ranks. He had started out as a private and had worked his way up to Major General. And he believed that anybody who wanted to succeed could do the same thing. He did not go to West Point. He went to the Army Staff College and the Army Infantry School. And therefore, the West Point officers kind of looked down on him. So he always felt he had something to prove. When he got to the 77th, that's one of the reasons that Pershing put him in charge, because he knew that Bobby Alexander was not going to let the 77th fail. And it was exactly what that division needed. The first thing he did, the first day he was there, he sat down with his officers, all of his officers. He went from unit to unit and he said, look, this is the way it's going to be. This is what I need you to do. You must work together. You must have better liaison. Then he went to all the senior NCOs, the sergeants and corporals, and did the same thing. The effect was amazing. And within a week, the 77th was doing what it was supposed to do. And that's a good thing, because they were just about to be pulled off of the Veldt and sent into the real meat grinder of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The Meuse-Argonne stands to this day as the largest and bloodiest battle that America has ever been involved in. 1.6 million doughboys would see action during this 47-day battle. We would lose an average of 550 men a day, KIA, every day for 47 days. Now, these are numbers that pale in comparison to a lot of things that had happened in the past 3.5 years, 4 years with the other allies. But for America, this was a real wake-up call. And this is where the modern American Army was born. We went into this fight as teenagers. We came out as adults. As you can see, there were divisions stretched all the way from the Argonne Forest to the Meuse River. And on the far left was the 77th Division. The 77th Division would be the only division to fight all the way through the Argonne Forest from top to bottom. The 28th, the 1st, and the 82nd would breeze through its eastern edges. But only the 77th would fight within this forest. And this forest, if you haven't been there, is primeval. In some places, when the trees are leafed out, the sun never reaches the ground. In some places, you can't see more than 10 or 12 yards in any direction, in many places less. Few places on the Western Front could be considered someplace worse for the style of combat that was being fought at that time. For centuries, armies have fought around the Argonne Forest. The Germans filtered down into it from the top to the bottom and set up many, many defensive positions in there. The French tried to get them out in 14, 15, and 16 and never could dislodge them. That's when the line went static there. It went quiet. It became a restful area for the Germans. As you can see by the lower left, these are the successive German lines which were set up in that area to fortify it. In the forest itself, there were two pre-positions or first positions called the Hagenstellung and the Hagen Nord. Beyond that was the Gieselerstellung, and beyond that, the Krumaldestellung. These were what they wanted to get through. When we went over the top on September 26, 1918 at 5:30 a.m., Pershing anticipated breaking through all three of those lines 72 hours. It took 12 days. In the Argonne Forest itself, where the 77th lined up, one officer referred to the forest this way. What they saw ahead of them in the Hagenstellung and the Hagen Nord was absolute devastation. Again, this is the classic World War I battlefield: trenches, shell holes, a destroyed forest. How they were supposed to get across it, nobody could figure. Rolls of barbed wire everywhere. But get across it, they had to. And then they had to continue on. And because of what they did here and beyond, the 77th Division would gain more kilometers of advance against the enemy than any other division in France. The Germans, on the other hand, loved the Argonne Forest. This was heaven to them. They set up and this is particularly true of the Germans pretty much all along the Western Front. They were there for a long haul. They were going to stay and make themselves comfortable any place they were. So they started setting up these beautiful bungalows and these beautiful pavilions. There was a modern railway system that went all over the forest and could take you anywhere you wanted. There was hot and cold running water, electricity, beer halls, bowling alleys, movie theaters, and one full-size concrete swimming pool. So the Germans pretty much had it made, and they wanted to keep the forest. Above all, they wanted to keep the forest. And it was also must be remembered that even though they were there making themselves comfortable, these were still military installations. Every inch of that forest was pre-sighted artillery target and machine gun target. While there were never enough troops, German troops in there to man all the positions, they didn't need to. They could get anywhere they wanted using the railway system, the trail system, or crawl trenches that were set up all over the place. The machine gun positions were perfectly sighted, and they would funnel troops using the pathways and the natural defenses. They would funnel troops into killing zones and then wipe them out. This was what the Germans were waiting with. And the 77th pushed on that door very hard on the September 26th, the very first day. We go over the top. And on the far left is the 308th Infantry of the 77th Division's lines. The 1st Battalion is leading the 308th in, and at the head of that battalion is Major Charles Whittlesey. He had gotten the job because he was next in line. He was not a combat commander, but he was determined to do a good job, just like he had done in the headquarters company. Now, leading men into combat, he would do everything that he could to make sure that his men were safe, but that he achieved his objective. Most people that have never served in the military don't understand that the objective is everything. And obtaining that objective means everything, particularly at that time. There were 13 tenets of combat that were taught at that time. And the 13th tenet of combat read, "Do not hesitate to sacrifice the command if the objective is deemed worth it." Whittlesey was determined to obtain his objectives, not waste lives, and win the war as fast as he could. He understood that if they attained their objectives, and they did it quickly, this could all be over. They needed to get it done. He was very determined and very focused. And he took his men in. And on the first day, they covered about 5 kilometers worth of ground, which is actually where they wanted to be at the end of that first day. On their left was the 368th Infantry. Now, the 368th Infantry was a liaison force that was connecting the French Fourth Army with the 77th Division. The 368th Infantry were colored troops, which is one of the reasons why they were over there. At that time in the United States Army, was very racially segregated. Pershing, even though he had commanded colored troops a good portion of his career, acquiesced to his more racist commanders that he had and gave his colored troops to the French to fight. And the French didn't care. The French were like, fine, we got all kinds of colored troops in our army, bring them on over. So the 368th went over there to fight. Unfortunately, they did not get what they were supposed to get as far as combat training went. The 77th went over, and this is what they faced. This is the kind of fighting that they went through. And when the 77th went into combat, the units fractured and came apart. There was massive dispersion. Besides the rough terrain, it was also rainy and foggy, and there's a lot of powder smoke from the 4-hour artillery barrage that led them in. And they had a hard time for the first 3 days tying the loose ends together. The 368th fared even worse. The 368th went across the top to this: wide open fields with no cover and virtually no artillery support. The 368th got hammered to pieces the first day, fell back, went forward again, fell back again, and then was pushed forward almost at gunpoint by many of their officers to fight one more time. The result, however, was less than spectacular. On the morning of September 27th, the 77th line, which is illustrated here by the black line A, was right where it should be. However, the 368th, the farthest they got forward was 1A. Where they wound up for the night was 1B. They hadn't come up far enough. There was an 800-meter gap between the left of the 308th and the right of the 368th. This was setting up a precedent that was going to lead to trouble in the very near future. They went over the top again on September 27th, trying to tie the ends together in that horrible forest, get everybody together. And they moved forward another day, gaining very little ground. But then we're told that their next objective would be the Moulin de l'Homme on the other side of Dead Man's Hill. They needed to take this position and drive the Germans out. This would be the first time that they really slammed the Germans in the face. They were starting to tie the ends together, gather their men together now, and the Germans were caught in the Argonne with their pants down. They hadn't anticipated that this battle was going to be as big as it was, that there would be as many Americans involved as there was. So they started to pull back. They were pulling back out of the Hagen and the Hagen Nord back into the main trenches of the Gisela-Stallone. And as they were doing it, and the 77th was moving forward, Whittlesey's battalion was getting out front and was obtaining its objectives faster and faster. When they came to taking Moulin de l'Homme, they went over the top of the hill. They looked down and they could see out into the forest. They could see the mill and the mill complex, and decided that they would wait until the next day to take this. For that night, they parked on the northern slope of the de l'Homme Hill, Dead Man's Hill. It's the northern slope. Now, this is where Whittlesey is betraying the fact that he really is having a hard time understanding what it is he needs to do. Parked on the north slope of this hill, he's opened himself up to machine gun, trench mortar, and artillery fire. Nevertheless, he sets up his men in a solid square Unfortunately, he is almost a kilometer ahead of his main line. Now, he had maintained liaison with his 2nd Battalion, which was on his right, illustrated here as lines 4 and 2. 4 is as far as the 2nd Battalion got. When they got there, the Germans split them away from 1st Battalion, which is the square marked number 1. And the 2nd Battalion fell back against orders to position marked number 2. On the far left, the 368th managed to make it to line 4. But by the end of the night, the end of that afternoon, they had pulled back to position at line 3. A portion of the 1st Battalion was left that stretched that line out from number 2 in the purple area right there. However, the damage had been done. Whittlesey was stranded out on that northern slope of Lower Hill by himself with about 400 men. He had no liaison on his right as the 2nd Battalion had fallen back. He had no liaison on his left for over a kilometer, almost a kilometer and a half, because the 368th had failed to keep up yet again. The Germans who were pulling back noticed this and surrounded him. They filtered in behind him with machine guns, and they began to slam this little organized square, which became known as the small pocket. This is the first time that Whittlesey would become trapped. Most people don't understand that he was trapped twice. This is the first time. And it was through a series of mistakes that were made by his 2nd Battalion commander, by himself, and also by the 368th Infantry, and by the German forces understanding that ground better than we could have. Whittlesey sets up his headquarters in this bunker on the top left. I don't know about you, but I love then and now pictures. I think it's great to be able to go to these places and understand what happened there and see it then. We've scouted up this picture of the bunker on Low Moor where Whittlesey set up his headquarters, and then we went and visited a few years ago. That's the picture on the lower left. The hillside of Low Moor is illustrated on the picture on the right. For the next 2 days, Whittlesey and his men would sit here and take heavy machine gun fire, a little bit of trench mortar fire, but they would be out of food and water and slowly running out of ammunition. Whittlesey starts contacting the back. Now, communications in the First World War are the one thing that everybody lacked. And since they could not bring field telephones up all the time, they had runner lines and pigeon messages. And Whittlesey starts sending pigeon messages back. By the 30th, he's got 3 guys that have managed to work their way back and alert headquarters what's going on. Lieutenant Arthur McCall, Privates John Monson and Jack Hershkowitz become the heroes of the small pocket. And they bring help up. They drive the Germans out. The Germans fall back solidly to the Gisela-Stellung, and Whittlesey's small pocket is relieved. He learns some good lessons here, but at the same time, his superiors did not. The attack plan changes on the morning of October 1st. From where they are sitting, right ahead of them is the Ravine d'Argonne. This is a north-south ravine, not particularly deep, not particularly wide, but very steep sides. On the left is Hill 205, and on the right is Hill 198. This ravine tees off at the other ravine called the Charlevaux, which runs east and west. Just beyond the Charlevaux ravine is a road about halfway up Mont de Charlevaux. This is their objective. They're going to go to that road and meet the French on their left. In this particular instance, the French are listed as the blue arrows. The US 308th is listed as the red arrows. The purple arrow on the right is the 307th Infantry, which is going to help them break the line atop Hill 198. They go into combat that day, and they fail to get far at all. The next day, when they're told to go back up there, Colonel Cromwell Stacy, who's in charge of the 308th Infantry, tells General Alexander, if you send them up there, I will not be responsible. He recognizes, Cromwell Stacy as a career officer recognizes that if they go up there, the chances of Whittlesey getting surrounded again or completely wiped out by the machine gun fire from the top of Hill 205 and the top of Hill 198 is very, very distinct. It will become a very untenable position and they'll get chewed to pieces. Nevertheless, Bobby Alexander says, you're going to go, you're going to send them up there. Stacy does send them up there with reservations. When Whittlesey gets these orders, he argues with Stacy. He goes and visits him at his command center and says, look, this is not a good idea at all. But he doesn't have any choice. So he takes his men up that ravine. This is the ravine in 2018. It looks exactly as it did then. It is absolute mess. And the commanding fields of fire from on top of both of those hills make it clear that there's no way you can pass that saddleback and get into the Charlevaux Ravine from the bottom of the Ravine d'Argonne. You will be cut to pieces in minutes. Unfortunately, Robert Alexander has never come forward and seen this. He still does not understand the battlefield that he's fighting. Whittlesey moves forward on the first and falls back. On the morning of the second, he's issued orders that the advance will be resumed at 0600. His objective, again, is the road, here marked number 4. He's going to take this and hold at all costs. This is irregardless of flanks, irregardless of casualties. Irregardless of casualties falls back in that 13th premise. Is this objective deemed worth it? If it is, we're going to lose everybody, that's fine. But as far as flanks go, now, if Whittlesey advances and doesn't mind his flanks, and his flanks advance and don't mind their flanks, then everybody advances together. That's the theory. Unfortunately, military theory doesn't always pan out to be military fact. So Whittlesey is faced with going up this position, and he's given his orders. You will send 1 unit to the left, 1 unit to the right, and you will go up the middle. They will guard the hillside, and you will blast your way through. The French will come up on your left. The 307th will come up on your right. You will meet on the road. And here's where the Charlevaux Mill comes in. In popular imagination, the Charlevaux Mill was the objective. That's not true. The Charlevaux Mill pictured here was on the left of where the 308th was coming up, and that's where they were going to meet the French in Liaison. The French were going to swing around Hill 205, and we're going to meet up with the 308th at the mill. The mill had no other, didn't figure at all in the orders. So the movie kind of played fast and loose with the facts of that, and the fact that there was a mill out in the middle of the forest where I don't know why it would be there, and it was destroyed, and there was nothing else destroyed around it. But in any case, Whittlesey moves forward on the morning of the 2nd, and the plan falls apart. So what happens is he's issued different orders. This time, he's going to break a company off, and he's going to send them to the left against Hill 205. That's illustrated by the yellow arrow. The yellow and the blue arrow coming from number 2, heading towards Hill 205. 2 companies, companies D and F, will keep the Germans busy on Hill 205. Meanwhile, off to the right, the 307th is going to battle up Hill 198, keep the Germans busy there. Whittlesey is going to shift his center organization, the red line going up the center, farther to the right. And that's going to be the line that the broken yellow line going up the right over the slope of Hill 198 on the shoulder. He will take both of his units and send them that way. That way they're going to get across. And it happens exactly as it's supposed to. That afternoon, before he sets out, when he receives these orders, he calls back. He calls back and talks to Cromwell Stacy, and Stacy says the commanding general is dissatisfied in your rate of progress. You are supposed to be there. You're supposed to advance. Finally, in exasperation, Whittlesey says, all right, I'll attack. Whether you'll hear from me again, I don't know. He throws the phone down and they go into combat. And by that evening, they have succeeded in getting across and into the Charlevaux Ravine. Companies D and F, illustrated by number 2, are keeping the Germans busy at 205. Meanwhile, Company L of the 307th makes it to the top of Hill 198 and extends over the top of the hill. This draws all of the Germans away from the shoulder off to the left and sends them farther to the right to combat with L307. At that time, as they're battling over there, Whittlesey skips right over the top of the hill and settles down into the Charlevaux Ravine. His flanks did not keep up. The 307th is not able to get through. The French cannot make it around the side of Hill 205, and that's it. They are now in an untenable position, exactly as Whittlesey said they would be, exactly as Cromwell Stacy thought they would be, and they are surrounded that night by the Germans. They are occupying an ellipsis in the middle along this hillside that runs about 350 yards long by about 100 yards wide. In the middle of this photograph here, you can see the big white streak. That is the back of the road. The Bainerville-Lauverget road runs across a cutting in the middle of the Mont de Charlevaux. That is the road there. On the bottom, barely visible, is a wagon road. Whittlesey learns from his experience of not digging in the proper place on Lone Moor and digs his men into the south slope. This way, artillery fire can't get at him. Now, he's reasonably sure that he's surrounded, but he doesn't know anything until early the next morning. More pictures of where they were surrounded. These are United States Army pictures taken after the war. On the left, you can see what's left of the footbridge that led into the Charlevaux Ravine from the base of Hill 198. The Germans knew they were there. The Germans watched them move into position, watched them dig in, but there wasn't enough Germans immediately in the area to stop them. It would be not until the next morning, morning of the 3rd of October, that they would bring in enough German troops to try to combat this impudent band of Americans. There were about 700 men dug into this hillside. 700 men packed into an area 350 yards by 100 yards. Whittlesey is starting to suffer from combat fatigue, and that accounts for the fact that he's got his men so packed tightly together. This is something that is commonly referred to as the mama hen syndrome. He needs to protect his men. He wants local control. He wants to take care of them. He can't do that as a battalion commander. He is supposed to be delegating that authority to his junior officers. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a lot of junior officers. There are only about 16 or 17 officers in there with him. But 700 men packed into that area is asking for trouble. He positions his companies like this. HBCHQ GA, he only has 19 men of A. Company E tries to break out on the morning of the 3rd to effect liaison to the left, is ambushed and almost wiped out. Only 17 men managed to trail back into the pocket. That morning, Company K of the 307th manages to break through on the right, but they're the only company that gets up. Once they get into the ravine, the Germans close the gate behind them. Now they're part of it too. On the left is William Red Cullen, who is guarding the left flank. The left flank is wide open. There's an open drill field there. If you go there today, there's a big pond there. But that pond wasn't there in 1918. It was an open drill field. The left, however, is full of woods, just choked with woods, as is the hillside. They're using this to protect themselves from the Germans, and it's necessary. Captain George G. McMurtry is the new 2nd Battalion CO. The first of the 2nd Battalion COs was relieved of duty just before they took off on October 1st. Captain Nelson Holderman is in charge of Company K307. Both of these men will be awarded the Medal of Honor for what they do in that ravine, while Red Cullen does not get the Medal of Honor. He only gets the Distinguished Service Cross. There's considerable controversy as to why that was. If anybody's interested, send me an email and I'd be more than happy to discuss it with you. McMurtry was a Rough Rider. He had been in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. He's 42 years old when he's in there, and he's already been wounded in the knee. Holderman would have the grand distinction that by the end of the siege, he would be wounded 7 times. He, including one wound that is a piece of shrapnel above his pelvic arch. He couldn't even stand unaided. He was using 2 broken rifles to hold himself up by the end and had a bandage holding his left hand on. By the time he got out of there and was awarded the Medal of Honor, he spent almost 6 months in the hospital before he could even walk again. Lower right, you see the 2 of them at a Lost Battalion Survivors Association meeting. This is in 1957, the year before George McMurtry died. This is the position as they occupied it. In the first 48 hours, they took 60% casualties. It was vicious, vicious fighting from all 4 points of the compass. The red arrows indicate the trench mortars. Almost from the beginning, the trench mortars were trying to pound them to pieces. The 2 up front, not so much, because the trajectory to get a shell into the pocket from above it was very difficult. However, the one on the back left really tore them apart and gave them a lot of help. The one on the right that was behind on Hill 198 only fired for a little while before they had to turn around and combat the rest of the 77th trying to battle through to Whittlesey. This is where the term Lost Battalion is a giant misnomer. Everybody knew where they were, including the American forces. We knew that they were there. We just couldn't get to them. Lost Battalion was a name that was coined by a newspaper article. There were reporters that were embedded with the troops up on the line. This isn't anything new for Iraq or Afghanistan or even Vietnam. First World War, we had them up there. And the one guy that was paying attention to all this was a fellow by the name of Damon Runyon, who would go on to have a celebrated career in literature. He was up there with the 307th, and he fished a newspaper article back on the night of the 4th to his editor in the States, who sent back one simple line: send more on Lost Battalion. It just sounded good. Lost meant that, not that we didn't know where they were, we couldn't get to them, and that the possibilities of them all being wiped out or lost were huge. Battalion just sounded good. Whittlesey actually had elements of 4 different battalions down there with him, including 9 guns from the 306th Machine Gun Battalion. So as you can see, a lot of this is kind of controversial, and it's things that they couldn't really portray in the movie that without a lot of explanation. But yeah, he was stuck down there and he was taking a beating, and the 77th almost wrecked itself trying to get through to him. Perhaps the worst thing that happened to them while they were down there happened on the afternoon of October 4th. There was an artillery officer in there with him by the name of John Teichmuller. He was from Battery D of the 305th Field Artillery. His job up front with the 308th was to call in artillery strikes on particularly difficult positions, and he had been pretty good at it. By the time they got into the pocket, Teichmuller was about as beat up as everybody else. Lack of sleep, atrocious weather conditions, not enough food, not enough water, gas poisoning. He was coming apart too. When they got into this position and they started taking trench mortar fire, he let a pigeon go. And that pigeon contained a message asking for counter battery measures. Unfortunately, when Teichmuller sent his message back, on the messages, positions on maps are measured by verticals and horizontals. And on his horizontal, he transposed the last 2 numbers of his position. This brought an artillery strike down on position number 1, which is right about where the 77th main line was. On the morning of the 4th, they decided that they were going to lay a barrage in front to try to drive the Germans off Hill 198. This would be position number 2 on the map here. What they wanted to do then was to lay a barrage behind Whittlesey to keep the Germans away from him so that he would be protected. Knowing that Teichmüller's message had the wrong coordinates on it and figuring what had likely happened, they transposed those coordinates. And that put what had been line number 1 on what is now line number 4 on the map. The artillery believed that Whittlesey was at position number 3. They believed that they were firing into the right place. Actually, what they were doing was firing across Whittlesey's position. It started at 2:30 in the afternoon on the 4th, and it would last for an hour and a half. And those 77th gunners were really good at what they did. The Germans joined in with glee, firing their machine guns into the position and dropping as many trench mortar shells as fast as they could. This was the low point, for the 308. This was the low point, and this is where Whittlesey showed his leadership more than ever. One of the things about Whittlesey is that he never crouched down. He would walk around almost totally upright all the time, seemingly unconcerned. He tried to convey to his men it wasn't as bad as they thought. This time, however, he was having a problem. This time he was having a hard time keeping them together as well as trying to keep himself together. By 3 o'clock, when he realized that the artillery wasn't going to realize their own mistake, he grabs this man, Private Omer Richards, who was one of his pigeoneers, drags him over to a hole, and he says, "We got to get a message out." And he writes the message, "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He hands it over to Richards. Richards takes this message, rolls it up, put in a little aluminum tube, and he reaches into his pigeon crate. He's only got 2 pigeons left, 2 birds left. He reaches in, he grabs one of his birds. And just then a shell goes off and the bird flutters away. Whittlesey says a very uncharacteristic, naughty word. Richards reaches in and grabs his last bird. Now, there is considerable speculation as to whether this bird's name really was Cher Ami or not. It doesn't really matter because this bird did what this bird did. Omar Richards clips the pigeon message onto his leg and sends him up. And the bird flies up and lands in a tree. Now everybody's kind of frantic, so they start throwing sticks and rocks up at him, trying to make the bird go. The bird won't go. He won't go. Instead, he hops up to a higher branch, and he just sits there. So swearing and under fire, Richards jumps out of his hole, runs across the field, leaps up onto the tree, and starts to climb the tree, shaking it as he goes. "Come on, you goddamn bird, fly." Finally, the bird takes off, and he heads down the ravine, and there's an explosion, and the bird falls to the ground. And nobody thought that he would get up. But there was one guy named Fred Everman who saw him get up. The bird takes off and heads off down the ravine. And about 25 minutes later, he lands at a mobile pigeon loft, and they read the message and realize what's going on. However, the artillery had already been alerted by an artillery observer who was behind the lines, who had stopped in to use the phone at Colonel Stacy's headquarters and had informed him that they were firing this barrage of protection that Stacy didn't know anything about. And when he showed him the coordinates on the map, Stacy flipped, said, "No, you're not firing to protect them, you're firing to destroy them." And they got the artillery on the phone and got them to stop their artillery barrage right about the time that Cher Ami was landing at the loft. Let's jump forward to 1968. The other man that's pictured here on the right, that's Lieutenant Sherman Eager. Sherman Eager was in the pocket, and he distinctly remembered as he ran past the hole, hearing those two pigeons cooing with fright in that crate. And it was one of the most mournful sounds he'd ever heard. And now he's at the Smithsonian Institution. And he turns a corner with his family. And there in a glass case ahead of him is Cher Ami. After the war, Cher Ami had come home. He had lost a leg, shot through the wing, shot through the breast, lost an eye. And he had lived. And he went home and had gone out on a bond tour and then had been retired to the old Pigeons home. Yes, that was a real place that the Signal Corps had set up. When he died in June of 1919, they stuffed him and they put him in the Smithsonian. Now, here comes Eager, 50 years after the event. For the very first time, he sees that bird since 1918, and he slowly begins to tell the story. And it's silent inside the museum. By the time he got done telling the story, there was a huge crowd around him who listened with rapt attention. And he looked at his kids and he said, outside of your mother, if it wasn't for that bird, none of you would be here. During the artillery barrage, Private Jack Garris, who was in charge of the other two medics who were helping to take care of the wounded in a long, low hole dug at the bottom of the hillside, went down there to see what he could do about calming down his charges. He had dug a shallow dugout into the side of the hill. And into it, he had put the worst cases. These are the ones that didn't likely to make it out of there. And he put them in there to give them a false sense of security and to keep anybody else from having to look at them. He crawled into this dugout to try to help his men, and it was hit directly by a shell. When Garris regained his senses, he realized he couldn't breathe and he couldn't move. He could move his left arm and his legs, and that was it. He began to say his goodbyes because he realized that he had been buried, when all of a sudden he felt a scratching at the back of his head and on the side of his face, and he could finally turn his head and get a breath. Somewhere along the lines in France, they had been in combat. Garris had picked up a little rat terrier dog named Billy, and he kept him with him, fed him his rations, and kept him relatively free of cooties. And now Billy, who was in the pocket with them, was digging him out. And when he got him out, he grabbed the dog and they ran down to the bottom of the hill. The lean-to had been completely destroyed along with everybody in it. The other two medics that were in there were Private Irving Sirota and Private Jimmy Bragg. Irving Sirota was from Russia. He was a Russian Jew. And everybody called him the Baron, which he thought was the coolest thing in the world. He would walk around with one hand behind his back, strutting around with this thick accent, and he would try to act like nobility. Everybody loved him. He was a great guy. Jimmy Bragg was from West Virginia in the South. And during Prohibition, after the war, he got bailed up for making moonshine. And they brought him in front of the judge, and he wore all his medals on his chest. And the judge pointed to me, he said, "What you got there?" He says, "Those are my medals. I got them in the Army in the war." He says, "What'd you do?" And so Bragg told him the story of the Lost Battalion, how he had taken care of the wounded and stuff. And at the end, the judge looked over at the sheriff and said, "You let him go and don't you ever bust him again. He can do anything he wants." Jimmy Bragg was quite a character. He lived for quite a while too. Following the artillery barrage, when it finally lifted after an hour and a half, the Germans launched a furious machine gun barrage, and they came in and scooped up a bunch of prisoners. Among them were these two men, Lieutenant Victor Harrington and Lieutenant James Leake. Both of these were replacement officers that had come in just before the battle and were in charge of Company E. Leake got wounded in the knee. He got wounded in the leg and he fell down, and he was trying to hide underneath a dead body. When the Germans came up and stuck him in the hip with a bayonet, he jumped. So they grabbed him up. Victor Harrington was actually, his nerves were so shot from being under fire that he was laying on the ground trying to hold still and pretend he was dead, but he was shaking so much the Germans realized he was alive. They took them back, and the two of them got their enlisted together that had been captured too, and said, listen guys, we got to try to convince the Germans that they don't have us beat. So they came up with this lie that they were going to tell the Germans that there was 2,500 troops down there with plenty of ammunition, and they had plenty of medical supplies and plenty of food, and they almost got the Germans to buy it. Leake was a lawyer in civilian life, and he told Lieutenant Fritz Prinz, who was the German intelligence officer, he told him, he said, they're New Yorkers, they're gangsters, they're never going to give up. They're never going to give up. And it was true. He got Prinz to almost believe it. And Harrington played the same kind of game. Now, the two of them would end up going to Villingen prison camp, where Leake would be reported as killed in action, and only later would be revived that he was not, that he was actually a prisoner of war. Harrington, on the other hand, nothing ever went home to say that he was a prisoner of war. He was listed as killed in action. And when he got home in May of 1919, he came home to find that his wife had married somebody else. Nevertheless, they got that marriage annulled, and he stayed married to his wife for the rest of his life. And Harrington, proving that he was not any kind of a coward at all, eventually became a prohibition agent and worked with Elliot Ness in Chicago. Now, two guys that went out, they realized that to try to get to these men, the 77th was breaking itself in half, but they needed to resupply Whittlesey and his men. They knew that they were going to be short on ammunition and food and everything, so they enlisted the 50th Aero Squadron, who was doing liaison duty with them, to try to drop packages to them. Now, this is the only spot where somebody didn't know where they were. And part of the reason behind that is because when you're flying over a forest, one section of a forest pretty much looks like the other section of the forest. And if you're in front of one ravine, you might as well be in front of another. The flyers from the 50th did a very good job at actually locating which ravine they were in. The problem is where exactly in the ravine Whittlesey's men were. They were dug in so tight and so deep that they couldn't be seen from the air, because they realized if they could be seen from the air, then they could be seen from the heights above them, and the Germans would tear them apart. So these two flyers, Lieutenant Harold Gettler, who was in the front seat, the pilot, Lieutenant Irwin Bleckley, who was the back seater, flew in their DH-4 aircraft and began dropping packages. Their plane got so shot up in the morning of the 6th that they couldn't fly it anymore. That afternoon, they came up with an idea. They said, if we don't know exactly where these guys are, let's find out where they're not. And they decided to fly back and forth across the ravine and let the Germans shoot at them. Then they could mark on the map the hot spots where the German fire was coming from. And by process of elimination, they would know exactly where to drop the packages. And this is what they did. They only made about a half a dozen passes, however, before Harold Gettler got hit in the head with a machine gun bullet. Bleckley tried to regain control of the plane from the back seat. He managed to get some control before Gettler's body, we believe, fell forward in the forward cockpit against the stick, and the plane dove into the ground. Bleckley was killed in the crash. Actually, he died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital soon thereafter, but they crashed. They were both later awarded the Medal of Honor for their bravery in trying to do what they did. These are two other men that were awarded the Medal of Honor. Both of them worked behind the scenes to try to get them out. Private Archie Peck and his unit tried to take out a German machine gun position to get through to Whittlesey, and all of his men in his squad were killed or wounded. And he went back with another soldier and dragged in the wounded under fire and won the Medal of Honor for that. Sergeant Ben Kaufman is my favorite guy to talk about because Sergeant Ben Kaufman, he was a real badass. Before the war, he was a Golden Gloves boxer. And while they were trying to get through to Whittlesey and his men, he and his squad went to take out a German machine gun position, and everybody in his squad was killed or wounded as well, including Ben, who took a shot to the right elbow. It shattered his elbow. Now, Ben Kaufman's pissed. So he tucks his arm into his belt, pulls his weapon, which is empty, charges the German machine gun position, jumps in the hole, beats the hell out of the crew, and forces them to carry their own weapon back to American lines, all with an empty weapon. Then he passes out. This guy is a serious badass, and I like him. The worst kind of soldier material I ever saw. This is what Whittlesey said of Abraham Krotoshinsky. On the morning of the 7th, Whittlesey decided to send out one more round of men to try to break through to the back. He'd been sending out patrols repeatedly. They had either been driven back in or killed in the process of trying to get back. He called for a volunteer. Krotoshinsky later said, they asked for volunteers and I got picked. So he grabbed Whittlesey's message and he took all day to crawl back to American lines. He eventually made it late that afternoon, in the early evening. He eventually made it, but he was so careful that while he was crawling back, the German actually stepped on his fingers without seeing that Abe was there. That's how dirty and buried he was in the brush. But Abe did eventually make it back and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for doing it, the first one to make it back. That same morning, 9 men from the left flank, Company H, decided that they were going to go try to get one of those airplane packages that had fallen down a ravine. Now, the flyers from the 50th had dropped all kinds of packages in the ravine, and not one single one had gotten to the Lost Battalion men. As a matter of fact, most of them had fallen in the German lines, and the Germans were enjoying the food and the chocolate and the medical supplies. And they would call down to the men in the ravine what was in each box. And the men in the ravine would get irritated and fire back. And it was a game that went on and on. Lowell Hollingshead was one of the men who went out with these 9. They were ambushed off the left flank. 5 were killed, 4 were captured. Hollingshead was the one who was wounded the least. He was shot just above the left knee. And this man on the far right, Lieutenant Fritz Prinz, who was the intelligence officer of the unit that was surrounding Whittlesey, persuaded Hollingshead to bring a message back into Whittlesey suggesting that he surrender. Hollingshead did this against his will, believing that he was actually, well, he knew he was a deserter, and he believed that he was acting as a spy, and he was really afraid that he was going to get shot for it by his own men. Whittlesey yelled at him, sent him back to his position, and then read the message. And as he read the message, a smile crossed his face, and he handed it to George McMurtry. McMurtry read it and laughed out loud and said, "We got him beat. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent this." And they handed it to Nelson Holderman. Nelson Holderman read it and smiled as well. When they suggested what they should do, Whittlesey looked around and said, "Well, we better get ready because it's really going to hit the fan now." They had laid their white airplane panels, the signal panels, out for the aircraft to see. They pulled them back in. They told everybody that this is what's going to happen. Nobody surrenders. Nobody flashes anything white. This is what's going to happen. This is where the big rumor is that Whittlesey was supposed to have read the note and turned towards the German lines. And being surrounded, one wonders exactly what direction that would be, and screamed that the Germans could go to hell. He never said it. He never said it. What he did say was, "Yep, we're in for it now. Tell everybody to get ready." And most of the men who were out of cartridges, they were almost completely out of ammunition by this time. Nobody had had a bite to eat in 4 or 5 days. They were drinking muddy puddle water. living in holes in the ground, doing everything that they had to, and I mean everything they had to in their holes in the ground. Whittlesey got everybody together, and about 5:30 that afternoon, the first wave of Germans came over, and they came over with flamethrowers. And Holderman on the far right flank could be seen standing, leaning against two broken rifles with a pistol in his good hand, whooping it up and shooting at everything that moved. This time, the American soldiers, who could barely pick themselves up out of their holes, who could barely lift their weapons, were so pissed at the Germans for suggesting that they surrender that they got up out of their holes and chased the Germans down, chased the Germans away. Then they fell back, and that was it. There was nothing left. If the Germans had attacked one more time, they'd have walked right across that pocket. But they couldn't do it because the Germans were ready to pull out, and they were pulling out. The line had folded up like this around the Argonne Forest, which was right here. The Argonne Forest was the only thing holding out. Everywhere else, the line was folding up. They had no choice but to pull out. Otherwise, they could have sat there forever. And at the last minute, that's exactly what happened. The Germans pulled out. Following the final attack on the Lost Battalion, that's what they did. The breakthrough came when everybody attacked the line all at once. But the real breakthrough came at point number 5, when they broke through the line on top of Hill 198, skirted around, and came up on Whittlesey's right. They broke through and drove the Germans away. They said that they could smell them a quarter of a mile away. When the men from the 307th broke through to Whittlesey, they walked onto that hillside and then walked back out vomiting. Combat veterans had never seen anything like it. There were bodies and body parts everywhere, pools of blood, entrails hanging in the trees. But what was worst of all was seeing the yellow-toothed, shocky grin of the men who were still alive. What they had gone through in those 5 days was absolutely incredible, was something that nobody would know about for years and years to come. In the end, the next day, they walked out of the pocket. There were 194 of the original 700 who went in, who were able to leave. 72% casualties in 120 hours. That's an average casualty every 13 minutes. Killed, wounded, captured. The final casualty in the pocket was Private Lorne Reed from Nevada. He died about 8 a.m. on October 8th before they could evacuate him out. Whittlesey went home after the war. He was awarded the Medal of Honor on December 24th, 1918. Hell of a Christmas present, huh? There were 7 Medals of Honor handed out for this one event. That would be more Medal of Honor handed out for any one event until the raids in Ploesti in 1943. It did not sit well with Whittlesey being a hero, however. He came home with a terrible case of PTSD. He was also, I believe, suffering from gas-related tuberculosis, and he was slowly dying. He couldn't stand to be around people. He couldn't stand to think about the war. Yet that's all anybody ever wanted to talk to him about, is what had happened, how he had led the Lost Battalion, the Iron Commander of the Lost Battalion. He just wanted to be left alone. He just wanted people to treat him as they did before the war, to look at him as they had before the war, but they couldn't. Worst of all was the visits from the parents and the wives and sweethearts of the men who had not been able to come back, asking him for any information on how their loved one had died, information that he couldn't provide. There's no way he could tell them what really happened. He attended the funeral of the unknown soldier. He was an honorary pallbearer in 1921, and soon thereafter, he decided to take a vacation. He was going to go to Cuba, he said, and relax. In truth, Whittlesey took matters into his own hands. He knew he was dying, and he was unhappy anyway. In 1938, Thomas Johnson and Fletcher Pratt. Thomas Johnson had been one of the reporters that had been there during the war, and Fletcher Pratt was a military historian. Decided to collaborate on a book about the Lost Battalion. This was the first true record of what had happened there, even though they took a lot of poetic license with some of the things, and they had to kind of hide names and identities for some people. It was still a very popular book for a long, long time. And it inspired the men to get together and form the Lost Battalion Survivors Association, an association that would meet regularly once a year until 1968 for 30 years. We last year began Lost Battalion tours. We take people to the pocket and the area of the 77th, as well as other places in the Argonne. If you're interested in seeing what the American forces did in the Argonne Forest, in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and hopefully we'll be expanding this to other areas of the Western Front where Americans fought as well. You can contact us. The contact information will be forthcoming in just a moment. We were there in 2018. We led U.S. soldiers and survivors' relatives, as well as a number of people. If you really like what you heard today and you want to know more, the book on the left, Finding the Lost Battalion, that's the big one. You get your belly full of Lost Battalion stuff, I guarantee it. And then when you're done, it's a big enough book so you can use it as a doorstop. It'll hold the door open real well. The book on the right is our latest one, The Lost Battalion as They Saw It. This is told in their own words. This is all the things that they had to say. In their own words. Wonderful, wonderful way to understand how they saw it, what they thought of it, for good or bad. And coming this fall, Soldier, Socialist, Patriot, Pacifist. This is the full story of Charles Whittlesey from birth to death. Everything that he went through and what he believed and why he believed it and why he did what he did. There's a lot more to the story than we touched on here. He was a very complex, intricate man, a very, very fascinating individual who had a lot to offer and went far too early. The contact information for our hero here, if you're interested in getting a hold of me and you just want to talk Lost Battalion, I'll chew your ear off. Not a problem. If you want to trade emails, feel free. Visit us online at Finding the Lost Battalion on Facebook and Lost Battalion Tours on Facebook. If you visit findingthelostbattalion.com, my website, I warn you, I am notorious for not keeping it up to date. I make every effort to do so, and unfortunately, you know what they say about good intentions. I do try to maintain it. I do get emails. If you do send an email through it, I will get it. If you do order a book through it, I will get it. I just don't update the website that often because I'm doing other stuff. But most of all, I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for attending tonight. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something. And feel free to contact me anytime. I'm always here. Simon, you want to open it up for questions?
I do. Thank you very much indeed, Robert. Fascinating. Even though I've seen the film, read your books, I think I learned a lot tonight as well. Can I ask people just to raise their hands? This is a kind of thing we do. It's some sound applause as an appreciation. I don't know if you can see it, Robert, but there are, well, more than 200 hands raised. Thank you very much. If you want to ask questions.
I actually don't see it, but that's okay.
Okay, yeah. There's 281. 209, well, it doesn't matter. You can put your hands down now, folks. What I'm going to do, Robert, is bring up the questioners. So somebody wanted to know, this was Meg Hardy, who took the photographs, the contemporary ones back in the, the black and white ones.
Most of the photographs that are taken of the site itself were taken by the United States Army. As far as the ones that are colorized, a friend of mine actually did the colorization. I wish I knew, but I don't. That official photograph of all of them together that was taken on October 8th, that is the actual survivors just before they walked out of the pocket. As far as the individual pictures of the men themselves, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families and the survivors' relatives, and gathered, oh God, I think the last time we counted, there was something like 3,000 pictures in the collection. Eventually, all of it will be digitized and put online for everybody to enjoy. But again, that requires time that I just can't seem to find right now. So,
yeah, we'll take the first question.
Okay, Robert, it's Graham Evans. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Hello. I can.
Yep, fascinating. What did the Germans first think of the American soldiers in July 1918, and what was their opinions at the end of the First World War? And what was their opinion post-war between the two world wars? Were their opinions about American soldiers in the Second World War initially based on their experiences of the First World War? Thank you.
The Germans didn't even think we were going to come over. They didn't think that we'd pull it off. It was a gamble for them. And so they just thought, yeah, they're not going to come. And even if they do, they won't be able to get their act together to make a difference before we defeat the Allies. And it was a race. I mean, America was not prepared. There's no way that we were prepared for what we had to do. At the same time, the Germans began to really understand what was what, because not only did we take an army of 250,000 and increase it 4.7 million in 19 months. That's an increase of 1,700% in 19 months. But we built a complete infrastructure in the United States to raise, train, equip, feed, and house them, and then ship them overseas. And then we built a complete infrastructure for them in France, too. It was the very first time that America flexed its muscles as an industrial might, and it scared the living daylights out of the Germans. They respected the Americans, but they thought they were fools. We made an awful lot of mistakes when we came over because we didn't listen. It's a very American thing to be the best. And we didn't listen. We didn't listen to what the French had to say. We didn't listen to what the British had to say. Had we done that, had we not been so, laser focused on open warfare, we probably could have saved casualties. We probably could have saved lives. After the war, the Germans had a healthy respect for the Americans. By the end of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, they understood that we had learned. We had learned the hard way, but they understood that we had learned. Between the wars, they had their own things to worry about. And Hitler himself, he understood that America could do what America wanted to do. And that's why he never wanted to really mess with England or America. But alas, he had no choice, the jerk. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for the question. Thank you. Bill, would you like to unmute and ask your question now?
Robert, that was fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. And all the more, I think, for told from an American raconteur's point of view. I'm going to change my question. I'm going to go ask you, how is it that Lower East Side city boys can get pitched into a European rural environment and do so well? Was the 16 weeks training that they did back in Camp Upton that good, or was it that they just learned really quickly on the job?
They learned very quickly what needed to be done. Just before, when they left the Vel, they had taken a lot of casualties in the Vel. They learned a lot on the Vel. I mean, they learned a lot, and they had taken a lot of casualties. And before they went into the Argonne, we took in replacements. The 308th took in 2,500 replacements. And it was then that those guys who had been at Upton realized how far they had come, because now they were responsible for training these replacements. And they got to see in the Argonne with the replacements exactly what had happened to them on the Vel. The weak sisters didn't last. The ones who couldn't adapt the on-the-job training couldn't last. They didn't last. The same thing happened with the replacements in the Argonne. The weak sisters and the ones who couldn't get it together, they died right off the bat. And that it was a very terrible way of doing things. It was one of those, you're either going to perform or you're not going to make it. And I think it's one of the things that people don't realize about themselves is that you have way more inside of you than you realize. And when you're put in positions where you it's perform or die, perform or lose something, you're going to dig down deep and you're going to find things that you never knew you had. I've talked to a lot of Medal of Honor winners. I used to write a weekly article called Medal of Honor Roll Call for a weekly rag out of Washington, D.C., where we featured a different Medal of Honor winner every week. And I talked to several of them, and they all said the same thing. I didn't do anything special. I did what needed to be done. None of them claimed to be heroes. It's the same thing when you start talking about these guys. And it's a lot like the average British soldier. The average British soldier did what had to be done. He got it done. He focused in, he got the job done. Same thing with the Americans, except we had such piss poor leadership at the beginning that, it kind of harkens back to what everybody thought in 1914. We're going to be done by Christmas. We're all going to be home. Both sides saying the same thing. I think America thought the same thing. We're going to get over there. We're going to take care of this. We're going to go home. And it wasn't quite that easy. So the American soldier found out how to adapt, found a way.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. Thank you. Ian, would you like to unmute and ask your question now?
Yeah, Robert, wonderful talk. That was fascinating, and I really hope to make it over to do one of the tours at some point. That would be a blast. My question for you is, in recent years, the 369th Colored Infantry attached to the French, the Harlem Hellfighters, have finally received their attention and their due and sort of recognition from the, obviously from the government in a very tangible sense with the Medal of Honor and all. However, has there been any, to your knowledge, acknowledgement of the fact that the 368th Colored Infantry in this offensive were basically used as cannon fodder?
Well, the 368th kind of gets short shrift. There was a book written a few years ago on what happened to them. And there's been a few monographs that have been done, but it's not like the 369th. Now, the 369th, the Harlem Hellfighters, they were the 15th Heavy Foot, New York National Guard before the war. So they already had a reputation. Wonderful, wonderful unit. And, they had Henry Johnson and all that in it and stuff. The 368th, part of the reason that the 368th gets short shrift is because in the first couple of days of the battle, they fell apart so bad. And they actually, at one or two points, had to be driven back to the lines at gunpoint by their own officers. And that was something nobody wanted to talk about. Nobody wanted to talk about that. And when they were relieved from the line on the night of September 30th over to October 1st, they had just started to tie the ends together. They were just starting to function really well. Had they had another 2 or 3 days, you would have seen them win. You would have seen the 368th, what they could really do. Actually, I know of very few support units that fought as hard as the 368th did. Just took it in the neck. They just took it in the neck. And you read the book, and it's kind of hard to follow in the beginning of the book because I talk about them and where the units were and how they just fragmented. But they kept at it. Very tenacious, very tenacious. But no, they never got everything that they were due. So.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Okay, Patrick, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you for an amazing talk, really. Well, my question is, in what way does the Lost Battalion inspire if at all, the mythos of the current U.S. Army? Are they still talking about like a spirit of the Argonne or something along those lines? Has it become something integral to the Army mythos itself?
The United States Army does not forget its heroes. And the two biggest heroes that they think about when you talk about World War I is Lost Battalion, Sergeant York. I mean, Sergeant York is the guy. He had the movie and all that stuff. So Sergeant York was the amazing Sergeant York. And then the Lost Battalion. The 82nd Division, of course, is still in existence. So they have long, steady history. And most people don't understand or realize that the 77th Division may not be around, but the 77th Sustainment Brigade has taken on their lineage. And the 77th Sustainment Brigade is hugely proud of what happened in the Argonne, not just with the Lost Battalion, but with all of what the 77th did. I mean, this is just one unit action in one section. There was also Dwight Chaffner won the Medal of Honor. There was another guy who won the Medal of Honor. There were small unit actions like this all over the place in the Argonne Forest, things that most people don't know about unless you're a huge 77th aficionado. But yeah, the 77th Sustainment Brigade maintains the legacy of the 77th, and they still will get together and talk about it. I've been blessed to be able to go and speak to the 77th Sustainment Brigade 3 or 4 times at Fort Dix about what their units did in the Argonne. And they have not forgotten. As a matter of fact, in 2018, it was my distinct privilege to be able to bring 77th Division soldiers current serving over to the Argonne and put them back on that hillside for the first time since 1918. And it was extremely moving.
Thank you, Patrick. We seem to have lost Douglas Rowe. I'll just read his question out. He asked, why did the American Army put the 77th, which was an urban division, why did they put them into the wilderness that was the Argonne?
You know, that's a good question, because they certainly didn't do it for their woodsman skills. One of the reasons that they were doing what they did is because they figured that that was one of the toughest areas, and they needed an experienced division to go in there. The 77th definitely was an experienced division. Now, if you follow that line of thought, then you have to wonder why on earth they sent the 79th Division up against Montfaucon, which was considered to be the toughest position in the whole Meuse-Argonne line, and the 79th had no experience whatsoever. There's a lot of things that just don't seem to make sense. And folks need to remember that there was a certain amount of politics in the American Expeditionary Force. All these guys that were the commanders of the divisions and the corps and all that, they all recognized the Army or the war as their chance for promotion. They get to make a name for themselves. They get to be the heroes, and they're going to do everything they can to be that hero. So they would lobby. They would lobby the military and say, Pershing, send me in. Our guys can take it. We'll do it. And certainly nobody was much more of a self-promoter than Bobby Alexander, who really thought a lot of himself. So I have no doubt that he probably went to Pershing and said, send us in there. We'll take care of it. Not a problem.
Thanks. David, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much, Robert, for a very interesting talk, and as well a reminder that it was a coalition war in so many ways. My real question is, a lot of Germans and people of German descent had emigrated to America, and were there many of these people of that descent, to your knowledge, in the 77th Division?
Oh, most definitely. As a matter of fact, there was a fella in Company E of the 308th. His name was Max Louis Probst. He had a brother in the German Army. And when Company E was trying to break out and get back on the left flank on the morning of the 3rd, and they got ambushed, Max Probst was at the front of the line, and he heard somebody call out, "What company is that?" from up on top of the hill. A couple of guys said, "It's E Company." He said, "What regiment?" 308th. And Max listened, and he said, "I can hear them talking. Those are Germans." And yeah, it was right after that the Germans launched on into a massive firefight. There were several others that were in the Lost Battalion that were German speakers and that were German descent. And when the Germans would call down to them, they'd call back in their own language, and they would say just absolutely filthy things back and forth. As the flyer that went down, Harold Gettler, the pilot, he was from Chicago. And when the war broke out in 1914, he actually went to the German consulate in Chicago and tried to join the German army because his family was German. Gettler was German. And they told him, nah, go home. This will be over before you even get back to Germany and stuff. And when we went to war, he decided that his real allegiance was to the United States. But yeah, there was a lot in my particular area where I live in Wisconsin. Huge German population. As a matter of fact, my family is German on my father's or my mother's side. And oh yeah, there's quite a bit of anti-German feeling and all that kind of stuff. There was a town north of here called Schlesingerville that during the war they changed the name of the town to Slinger because they just didn't want to be associated with the Germans.
Thanks, David. Thank you. Well, I think we've run out of time. There are still quite a few questions that we're not going to have time to get round to. So could I just ask people once again to thank Robert for his talk tonight by raising hands. And they're going up. They're going up. Robert, thanks ever so much again for the talk. It's been fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
That's gone into Facebook tonight, and obviously in time it will appear on our YouTube channel. Right, folks, almost time to wind up. Just a reminder that we've got more online events coming up on Saturday morning. Well, on Saturday, it's the annual WFA President's Conference. We're having 2 sessions, 2 2-hour sessions, one at 10 o'clock in the morning and one at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We've got 6 speakers in all who will be talking about a reappraisal of the year 1915. All the details are on our website. And then next Monday, we're carrying on with our Monday night webinars. And Jim Tanner will be talking about an action that took place concurrently with the events that have been discussed tonight. This is about 100 miles northwest of the Argonne. And it's the 42nd North Midland Division and their attack and capture of the Riqueval Bridge. So that will be a good one as well. Just remains for me to thank Robert once again, and I'll be in touch over the next few days, Robert. But thanks again, and thank you everybody for attending. Hope you enjoyed it. But for now, good night.
Thank you very much, Simon. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Thank you.
Mademoiselle.